right, everyone. Welcome and hello to my Ask an Angel series, where we discuss topics related to the world of startups, entrepreneurs, and investing. I'm your host, Jonathan Hung, and in today's episodes, I'm joined by Karan Wadhera. Karan Wadhera is the managing partner of Casa Verde Capital, where he leads investing strategy, fundraising, and manages the portfolio and team. He is an experienced finance professional who held senior roles at Goldman Sachs and Nomura previously. Thank you so much for being on the show, Karan.
Thanks, man. Great to be here.
Yeah. Great. So let's jump right into it. I love talking to other general partners, other fund managers. So what got you into the investing, into the VC world from where you were at Goldman and Nomura? What made you make the jump?
I've always been pretty passionate about investing and being an entrepreneur in general. I started my first business when I was in college, which did new media consulting for record labels and artists, which is how I got to know Los Angeles, which is, where both of us are based, and where I first started cutting my teeth as an entrepreneur. I had this really traditional career in investment banking and trading at Goldman and Nomura, but alongside it, I always remained active. So, started some more companies, invested in a bunch of businesses. So it was always something that I was really passionate about, but was more of the sort of side hustle as opposed to the main gig. And, it all kind of came to a head around 2014 and 15, where, you kind of reached that juncture of, hey, is this still going to be the things I do in my free time, or should I really, dive into it wholeheartedly? And I think that was an inflection point for me. And I decided that if I wasn't going to do it now, I wasn't ever going to do it. And so in 2015, I left, a real cushy, comfortable life, left Asia, which is where I was based at the time in Hong Kong, started exploring different opportunities everywhere, and got really compelled by what I was seeing in this emerging industry of cannabis, and decided that I should be spending all my time, and here I am.
Yeah, no, wonderful. And then speaking about cannabis, what drew you to Casa Verde Capital, the team? I mean, why cannabis versus anything else as a focus?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that I spent my time before Casa Verde in emerging markets, and it was really interesting to see, what happens when a market starts coming to life. The place where I experienced that the most was in India. I spent 7 years there. I got there in 2006, saw the mobile revolution happen in front of my eyes, saw this massive population skip over, the laptop, desktop, and go straight to mobile, and all the services and things that came with it. And then also, could see in front of my face the changes that were happening in society, not just how people, dealt with each other, but infrastructure, et cetera. It was pretty amazing. And I got really drawn to these emerging sort of areas. And cannabis was no different, right? Which is that even in 2015, 16, when I was starting to explore the space, it was really obvious what was happening from a macro perspective. Legalization was coming, globalization was happening. There were all these really bright entrepreneurs who wanted to build businesses in the space, but the issue was there weren't really any institutional investors to support them. So for me, that was the kind of light bulb moment, because I remember this similar dynamic in India, right? Which was yeah, it's interesting. I see the numbers, I see the demographics, I see the GDP growth, but it's India. Who wants to touch this, third world, messy, dynamic place? It's not for us. And cannabis was really similar, which was that the numbers were clear. It was obvious there was a market. There was a huge burgeoning economy that was going to build behind the industry, but there weren't many people who wanted to touch it. And, those who were ready to take the leap and take the risk often were rewarded handsomely for it. And so I wanted to be one of those people.
Yeah, that's great. And so, you talk to other investors like myself, and people necessarily get scared away, right? They don't want to necessarily invest in a vice. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on your confidence in the cannabis space, and why, are people being less hesitant? And because sometimes you have certain LPs, right? And you raise funds from your LPs based on what their comfortability level is, what their interest is, what exposures they want to be in. And I'm full disclosure, everyone, I'm an LP in Casa Verde 1 and 2,
Thank you very much. Very cool to get that.
Of course. And I see the difference, right? From the first fund to the second fund, and how you've been able to grow it. And I'd love for you to just tell everybody your journey from the very beginning till now? Like how is it easier? Is it more work? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, well, as you know, raising money is never easy, and raising money for a fund is even more challenging at times because, I'm asking you to bet on my thesis and my belief, but then I'm also asking you to bet on me and that I'll make all the right decisions, right? And those are often hard, mountains to climb for some LPs. But I was lucky to have a number of people who believed in the kind of vision and supported what we were doing. But then after a while, it all becomes about track record, right? And execution and showing that, hey, not only what I'm doing resonates, but there are others who believe. And while we all want to be leaders and not necessarily get sort of tagged on by, followers, the reality is when you have, name brand VCs investing alongside you or investing behind you into deals, that gives people more confidence. And I think those were really important milestones for us as a firm. Right, we've been really fortunate to be the conduit for a lot of these guys to come into the space, whether it's your Tiger Globals, Founders Fund, Dragoneer, D1, Thrive, et cetera. I think once people saw, these VCs that they were more familiar with or more generalist in nature were taking a plunge into our space and were excited by our companies, that gave them more confidence. And then, it becomes a snowball, right? Deals beget deals, flow begets flow, and more now. We generally don't run into that question, right? Like when I first started, the question was, is this real? Is this really an industry worth investing in? That's no longer the question. Now it's about every other question you have, right? Like, are things too frothy? Is it too expensive? Is this gonna work? Is Google, Amazon gonna come eat your lunch? All the similar things, but the viability of the industry, that, I can only chalk up to good timing, right? Whereas that may have been an issue when we first started. It's just so clear now, right? We've gone from a few states to 15 states here in the U.S. which have legalized for adult use. I think Rhode Island, today when we're filming this, just announced that they were going to fully legal. Like it's nonstop, and now it's no longer a domestic story, but it's really an international story. So I think all that really helps.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. And then speaking of that, I think it's always interesting talking to investors about their deal flow and where do they find these great companies, right? I mean, I'm sure 2020 was a struggle for everybody. That was different. You can actually meet people in person. So, but now things are opening back up. Do you think it's better to still meet in person or just find ways to connect online?
I think it's both now. We're truly in this hybrid environment. I do love meeting in person. I think there's things you can really garner from an in-person conversation that are harder to do. But like everything in life, we adapted, right? And we learned how to do these conversations virtually, which may have been, in a conference room otherwise, or, be able to go. I think what we were most concerned with is how are we going to get through all the kind of diligence and do the number of calls that we would need to in order to comfortable. And the reality is we just adapt. We're incredibly adaptable people. So we make it happen. But now that we're moving into an environment where we can travel, we can sit in person, that's definitely the preference for me still. It's not ever going to be a barrier to doing a deal, but it is something that I prefer. And I think also it goes a long way into the future for building long, enduring relationships, right? And I think that goes not just for companies, but that goes for LPs and investors like yourself, right? I think our relationship is much more stronger and durable because we've been able to spend time together in person, break bread. I think it makes a whole host of difference if everything was just built on a sort of virtual medium. Yeah,
absolutely. So, we know, one of your main partners, right? Of course, he's a celebrity, but we love to ask, what makes you and your team uniquely qualified to be in this space? I remember hearing Snoop one time saying, on Howard Stern, so you made a shout at the Casa Verde team, and I remember you saying one time, listen, he's not doing not necessarily all the diligence of running the spreadsheets, but it's how do you tell people that you, the Casa Verde team, are so well equipped, and I can vouch for you guys, but I'd love for you to tell people, why you at Casa Verde gets this space so much than others.
Absolutely. Well, look, our famous partner in Snoop has always been helpful to get us, probably more attention than others, and that's a huge benefit, right? When you're building a firm and want people to know about you and want people to hear your thoughts, it's always helpful to have a loud microphone like that attached to your brand. So it's always been really helpful. I don't think what people know is that it's been a relationship that's been ongoing for over 20 years, right? I first started working with Snoop and got to know him when I was 19 years old. So that's what kind of makes it unique. But I'd say what separates us here, and especially when we first started, is that we focused a lot of our attention on the ancillary periphery technology businesses that supported the cannabis industry. So we did carve out our niche and have a certain level of expertise in point of sale, e-commerce, compliance, financial services, staffing, all these businesses around the industry that benefit from the macro theme of legalization and globalization, but weren't bogged down with some of the licensing issues and the regulatory hurdles that companies which touch the plant may have to face. So I think that's how we got to develop a real expertise. And then, we're incredibly proactive investors, right? We lead the majority of the deals we're in. We take board seats or minimum board observer roles. We get really hands-on in business development. We get really hands-on when you're raising subsequent rounds and bringing folks to the table. So I'd say after a while, your reputation starts to speak for yourself. And I'd like to think that's what's happened with us. After, having backed, what I believe will continue to be some of the foundational companies in our space, that reputation starts to speak for itself, and our founders become our best mouthpiece, right? There's no sort of validation more than that, which is that a founder's had a great experience with you as a VC and a partner, and can lead the next generation of great companies your way as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so right now, what do you see in the cannabis industry that excites you, right? Because you talk to certain people out there in the space, licenses aren't that big of a deal. The growth might not be there just to sell the product itself, but there's other ways, where it makes sense where you want to put your money to help this industry grow.
So look, I still think there's a lot of opportunity in great vertical software that's being built for the space. As an industry matures, it needs more and more resources. It needs more edge from a data perspective, business intelligence. It's we're leaning more into some of these niche verticals on the technology side, but which are still so relevant because while cannabis has had a number of kind of large explosions from from an attention perspective, right? It's gotten hot and then not, and hot and not again. Not too dissimilar from like crypto or something like that. The reality is we're just scratching the surface as far as penetration goes, right? The black market is still multiples larger than the legal market. We still have a huge swath of the population here in the U.S. which doesn't have access to it. So there's just still such a long way to go. We're still in very early innings. That being said, an area which is even further, even earlier on in its maturity and development is Europe. And we're super, super bullish on opportunities there. My business partner is currently in Germany, having a lot of those meetings. We've made 2 investments there, made an investment in Portugal, done some work in the UK. I'll be out in London at the end of next month. There's just, we see a lot happening there. We see a lot of parallels with what happened in the US and what will be relevant in Europe. But beyond that, what's even more exciting is that in Europe, a lot of this regulatory work that's happening is happening at the federal level. So you don't have that same kind of frustrating dynamic that you have here in the US, where it may be legal in California, but at the federal level, it's Schedule 1 narcotic, which you can't have bank accounts, you can't take advantage of normal tax treatment, you can't list on U.S. exchanges. There's tons of issues, and in Europe, a lot of those are mitigated. So, I'd say a lot more of what we're doing, technology, foundational businesses. Europe is a huge focus, and eventually we're getting more and more bullish on the opportunity for consumer-facing brands. It's still early, but we do believe, like lots of other consumer segments, brands will take on a big chunk of the value of the industry.
Yeah, no, wonderful. And so from, a portfolio company standpoint, how many do you try to work with at any one time from your funds? How big is the team? How do you allocate your time when you make an investment decision?
constant struggle. That's the reality. It's always hard. We are about 8 people. We have invested in over 25 businesses at this point. Probably active between myself and my partner on 15, 16 boards. It's a lot. And so allocating your time, being efficient, spending your resources wisely is always part of the battle. Fortunate to have a really great team who can take on some of those burdens. But yeah, it's just constant, time management and reprioritization. And because we choose to be really proactive, that means that we have to be really selective on the kind of deals we do. And so but we love it. And the one fortunate thing is that everything we do is largely in this space, right? In the cannabis industry. So that does allow for, that same kind of central knowledge pool to be applied sort of across businesses. Whereas if I was doing, 10 different industries, et cetera, it may be a little more challenging because we're so hyper-focused. It's somewhat of an advantage.
Yeah. And I always like to tell people too, I've been fortunate that I have not had a lot of LPs, but I'm about to start a new fund that will. But then people don't understand, running a VC fund isn't just about finding the best companies, right? It's also not necessarily managing, but working with your limited partners, right? It's so key. I love to hear, how does Casa Verde, I know how you guys do it. You really give really good updates. You keep us in trend of what's going on. But there's always good customers and bad customers, right? I'm sure there's some people who are blowing you up constantly, or some people you don't even hear from. You don't hear from me that much. But how do you balance that with the work you do, right? With the LPs?
Yeah, it's difficult, and I think it's not something people really understand when they think about our industry, right? Yeah, there's an entire operational part of it which is so critical. Not just the LP relations. There's an entire host of service providers, from fund administrators to accountants to auditors, right? To there's just a whole subset of this that's just as critical. And to be successful, that has to be incredibly tight, because it's not just about delivering solid returns. Obviously, that's key, and that's how you'll raise subsequent funds. But if you're not transparent, if you're not reporting on time, if you're not clear, if you're not, can't be making mistakes on, people's K1s and financial statements, these things are really important. And as a fund manager, you need to understand those things fully, because in order to, build a successful business, that has to also, be incredibly tight. And I think that's something that people probably don't know enough about. But yeah, fundraising and managing LPs is a completely additional full-time job, which you have to tack on the 2 other jobs you have, which is running a team, running all the administrative processes, and then on top of it, finding great investments and managing your portfolio. So yeah, it's it's a 5-in-1 kind of role, unfortunately.
Yeah, no. That's why we do these podcasts. I want people to understand it's not just we pick the next Coinbase or the next Dutchie and it's over. A little bit more work to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Karan, switching gears, I'd love to get your perspective. How do you stay up to date? Are there any books, publication, podcasts, that you read or you tell your portfolio companies to check out? That keeps them relevant, especially to the cannabis space or to just investing in general.
Yeah. You read a lot. Look, I'd say, the basics are always there. You want to be reading, your business rags, whether it's, the TechCrunches or Axios, and stay, subscribe to the relevant newsletters. But a lot of that is just to stay current and know what's going on. I think, I listen to a lot of podcasts on the weekends, when I have time to myself to hear how other investors think. I really there's probably too many to list. But it's always just fun to get a different perspective. And then, as far as reading goes, that's generally reserved for my vacation time, where I can have, a lot less noise, and I can kind of dig in. I love biographies, and that goes in and outside of investing, in and outside of cannabis, obviously, but, into all sorts of professions. Because at the end of the day, like, I'd say this job and lots of jobs, both as entrepreneurs and investors, is just about mental fortitude and keeping yourself motivated, keeping yourself, sharp, and, allowing yourself kind of like that room. So, one of the things that I do is I block out time in my week, just to have a alone time or focus time to do real work or do real reading. I think that's incredibly important because it generally happens in our profession. It's just these small decisions sometimes which can have massive outcomes, right? Being able to dig in, find the right entrepreneur, find the right, folks that lead you to the right deals or lead you to the right LPs. It's usually, some sort of those moments where you get, really great ideas that can be helpful to your journey. And so for me, that's always been really important. So yeah, a lot of different podcasts, reading regularly. I have like my morning sort of time to just catch up on news. And on the cannabis side, there's like 2 or 3 really good newsletters and websites. New Cannabis Ventures is one. There's a gentleman named Datron who has a really good newsletter Substack that he sends out, which always has good updates. And there's a few others that we kind of stay and keep current on.
No, that's great. And I got a couple more questions, but I'm just curious, like, on your thoughts, like, you're a cannabis investor. So what do you think about this whole thing with NFTs and Web3? Like, how does it relate to what you're doing now? I mean, I don't think it's just putting on some goggles and like you're in a new universe, like, or just buying, a bored cannabis ape. I don't know. Like, what do you think makes it relevant to what you do and how you invest and what you're looking to invest in?
I've dabbled personally, not yet through the fund. I mean, I think it's super interesting. I think, out of these often hyped up industries land some real utilities and real businesses, right? And I think I wouldn't say we're completely out of the hype mode yet, but I think soon we'll be in that place where we'll start to understand, like, what are the interesting businesses there. There's a world where, Web3 and NFTs have a place across every industry, and cannabis would be no different. I'd say, one of the things that people have tried to explore in our space has been, can you use that infrastructure to kind of circumvent payment issues that you have in cannabis? And I feel like that's it doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's probably would be quick to get shut down, right? Like using cryptocurrency to as a way to sort of transact and not go through credit card rails and things like that. Again, right. I understand where that appeal is. It's just very, I think, unlikely to work. But yeah, I'm fascinated by business in general. So any emerging industry is unique to me. I think this area has gotten a lot of attention and a lot of hype, but eventually some real businesses will emerge, and that's just solely due to the fact that some incredibly smart, bright people working on these ideas. Yeah,
absolutely. And last question I'll have to ask you is, like, for the person who wants to get into venture capital investing, what advice would you tell them, to become a VC or, get into the investing game? I mean, like I've heard Eileen Lee, a Cowboy, say, like, hey, it's like, okay, either, you have a great exit, you have some money, and now you're an angel investor, or really you just work your way up, right? But I'm curious, like, what your perspective is on getting into venture.
I think there's a lot of journeys to get into the seat. Mine is very non-traditional, right? I didn't I worked at an investment bank, but I was a trader. I largely worked in public equities. I didn't go, work in M&A. I didn't go work in private equity. I didn't work for another venture capital firm. I decided to choose an area which didn't have a lot of resources, and by nature became a scarce resource as someone with money looking to invest in cannabis, and then graduated into becoming a VC. So I would say that's my story is a little unique, but I'd say the thing that helped me the most and that gave me the confidence as we were building this business and being confident as an investor is to start investing. Like, that sounds so silly, but like, anyone can start investing. There's so many great resources now, whether it's in public markets or some of these, sort of angel list equivalents, et cetera, the ways just that you can put a few $1,000s to work, it gets you into that habit. And by default, like the first few things you're going to do will be terrible because you likely don't have access to good deals and you're going to want to do something because you're ready to start and you'll make mistakes. But it's, you learn the most often from your worst deals and then you make sure you don't kind of repeat those mistakes going forward. And so it's a business that, thrives on sort of repetition and getting, being in a lot of pitch meetings, speaking to a lot of entrepreneurs, reading a lot of pitch decks, going through a lot of models, making the right calls, but often making the wrong calls and then learning from there. And the more you do, the better you get. So I would say my number one piece of advice is get it. When we interview anyone who wants to work at Casa Verde, that's the first thing, the first question. Why? What do you like? What do you invest in? If I gave you $1 million, where would you be writing a check into and why? And then let's dive deep into it. So that's, and there's nothing like it. And I remember this from when, I started as a trader. It was an interesting business, learning about the public equities markets and reading research reports. But the minute I started putting my own dollars to work, I knew more about those companies than anyone else because now it had my money. So I really wanted to make sure the right things were going the right way. I think that's the same thing in private markets as well. So that would be my piece of advice of, aside from doing all the hustling and getting in front of, people like you and me and others, and there's a million ways you can do that. But actually starting to put money to work is the best way to start to understand if this game is for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you're trading OPM, other people's money, it's not the same. When it's your money, you got to do a little bit more work.
No, that's just the best trading, right? And then and then but you get into a role where it is third party capital and whatever, there's a little bit of that additional risk tolerance which you have, which actually is positive. But the lessons learned from making those same mistakes yourself, and that's honestly what it is. You will make mistakes. Maybe you'll get lucky, but likely you'll make mistakes. And that's just the best way to learn from it. You can read as much as you like, but until you've gone through that entire process, you won't really get the feel for what the business is like.
Absolutely. Well, you know what? Thank you so much, Karan, for being here. If anybody wants to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yeah.
LinkedIn, please.
Apologies. A little bit of a noise at the background. But LinkedIn, Instagram, we try to be pretty active there. And also, on our website, if there's businesses to pitch or whatever, we're I'm not sure how everyone else does, but we do read everything, and every sort of piece of communication that comes to us one way or the other gets read. I mean, if it's not responded to, it does get read. So
That's right. Okay, great. Well, thank you again for joining me today. And we'll see everyone on the next episode.
Thanks
again,
Jonathan.
Karan.
Thanks for having me.